In the 15th century, while the French people were fighting desperately against the attacks of English soldiers, an illiterate peasant girl who heard the voice of God would save them from this misery. This miracle that changed the course of history was named Joan of Arc. The 100 Years' War, which had been ongoing between France and England, had just ended. In these years, and it was expected that the pains of war would ease, the English were aiming to take control of France's governance. At this very moment, an illiterate peasant girl managed to save the Capetian dynasty from the expected end. This girl, whose name was Joan of Arc, was born in 1412 in the village of Domremy on the Meuse. Her father was one of the most prominent landowners in the village. Jean was a very devout child and had started to see the pain and misery in the lands she had been living in since a young age. At the age of 12, she began to say that God was speaking to her and that she had a sacred destiny. As she grew older, the voices and visions she heard from the supernatural realm increased. Eventually, her belief that she was given the task of saving her country and that the real ruler of the country had to be crowned at the Reims Cathedral became increasingly strong. This was a sacred duty given to her by God. The society and her family in which she lived found Jean's ideas quite insane. Although her father, who was a simple peasant, tried to dissuade her from this path, he was not successful. When Jean reached the age of 16, she went to the castle of Robert de Baudricourt, who governed her region, and asked for someone to accompany her to Chinon. Robert was a simple soldier and not someone who would believe in such sacred stories and that the task of saving the country could be given to a simple peasant girl by some saints and holy figures. He advised her to stop dealing with such silly things and sent Jean back to her village. However, Jean wholeheartedly believed in the sincerity of her inspiration and worked persistently to get her request granted, and eventually Robert gave her the guard she wanted. In 1429, Jean, dressed as a man, set out for Chinon with 6 soldiers. When she arrived there, she found King Charles in a state of helplessness, not knowing what to do against the English. She introduced herself as the legitimate child of the king and convinced him with her story. Charles was ready to publicly announce his belief in Jean, but he had one condition: Jean had to undergo an examination before the Assembly of Clergy in Poitiers. On April 28, wearing a suit of white armor and carrying 5 sacred swords, Jean took command of her army and marched to lift the siege of the city of Orléans, which was under English control. A 4,000-strong army and a group of priests arrived at the outskirts of Orléans and joined forces with Count Dunois troops. The French soldiers they found there had been thoroughly subdued by the English army. However, her belief in divine destiny also encouraged the soldiers and they attacked the English with great force, succeeding in a major victory by leaving the city. The real victory, however, was achieved after a week-long battle when the seemingly impregnable Tourelles castle was captured. Joan of Arc fought at the forefront of the army, even climbing the ladders that reached the walls of the castle. Seeing this, the soldiers were also inspired by her courage and they heroically won this seemingly impossible battle. Orléans was now saved. After this event, the English morale was broken by the blow they received, and they suffered consecutive defeats. On the other hand, the armies led by the young girl were running from victory to victory. Joan of Arc was eventually welcomed with great joy and admiration in Lyon. She had begun to be seen as a saint by the people. Joan, who believed that her mission was now complete, took Charles to Reims where he was anointed with holy oil and crowned in a ceremony according to tradition on July 16. Joan knelt before the king who ascended to the throne as Charles VII and exclaimed, "My noble king! The will of God has been fulfilled. I have cleansed Orléans of its enemies and made it possible for you to wear the crown. God has shown that you are a true king. Now, the entire kingdom of France belongs to you." Joan had achieved her victory, but Paris was still in English hands. She asked Charles for permission to cleanse Paris of its enemies, but Charles was afraid of angering the Duke of Burgundy. Knowing he couldn't stop the young girl, he arranged a deception and sent her to battle with an insufficient army. With her previously defeated and demoralized soldiers, Joan was once again defeated while wounded. To make amends, Charles bestowed nobility titles on her and her family and exempted her village from taxes. However, the young girl had a different desire. One day, Joan heard that the Burgundians, whom she thought were her allies, were marching on Compiègne with the English. She wanted to go to the aid of her friends, but as soon as she left the city, she was captured by the Duke of Luxembourg. The young girl was captured by the Duke of Luxembourg, and among her captors was a priest named Cauchon, who sought revenge against her. Cauchon wanted her to be tried in an Inquisition court. However, they did not want her to become a saint in the eyes of the people, so they accused her of witchcraft, claiming that the voices and visions she heard from the divine were the work of the devil. She was harshly judged with quite absurd excuses. They claimed that her wearing men's clothing was an insult to her gender and that speaking to God without the intermediary of the church was disrespectful. In court, she responded to these accusations by saying, "The light comes from God, and it is up to you whether or not you believe it." Finally, a document was forced to be signed by Jean in which she admitted to all the charges against her, and on May 30, 1431, she was burned alive at the stake in Rouen. Just before the execution ceremony of Jean began, she asked for a cross from those around her. A soldier made a cross by joining two sticks together and handed it to her. As the flames began to engulf her, Jean brought the cross she held to her lips and her last words were, "Jesus." 25 years after the event, King Charles re-established the court and cleared Jeanne d'Arc's name. In 1919, Pope XIV. Benedict declared her a saint among the blessed ones in the Catholic Church. Every year on May 30th, Joan of Arc Day is celebrated in France. The life, personality, and characteristics of Joan of Arc have greatly influenced the world of literature. Thank you for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and leave a comment.